Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian Literature for the Inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit.
And I'm Cameron Lalana.
This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. 6 parts ago in Crime and Punishment, there was a crime. Now let's talk about some punishment in the epilogue, maybe. It's a large task, but thankfully joining us for this wrap-up is Dr. Kate Holland. Dr. Kate Holland is an associate professor of Russian literature at the University of Toronto, as well as the president of the North American Dostoevsky Society. Her research includes the historical, cultural, and institutional context of the 19th century Russian novel. Among a great deal of other work, Dr. Holland has also co-edited a Dostoevsky companion, Text and Context with Connor Doak, and friend of the podcast, Katherine Bowers, as well as Dostoevsky at 200, the novel in Modernity, also with Dr. Bowers. In Dostoevsky at 200, which is open access and linked in the show notes, thanks Cameron, Dr. Holland contributed the chapter, The Poetics of the Slap, Dostoevsky's Disintegrating Dual Plot. Dr. Holland and Bowers are working on Digital Dostoevsky, a computational text analysis project on Dostoevsky's novels, so suffice to say, plenty of qualifications to be joining us who have not done nearly as much work on Dostoevsky on the podcast. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
If you have any plugs or anything that you want to discuss, now is your time.
Yeah, so there were just a couple of things that I wanted to mention since we're talking about today about the epilogue to Crime and Punishment. There's actually a Canadian Slavonic Papers special issue on the epilogue to Crime and Punishment from June 2020 with 3 excellent articles by myself and Katty Bowers and also Eric Nyman, and an epilogue to that issue by Robin Foyer Miller. So that's if you're interested in reading further, that could be a good place. And I also wanted to mention a couple of books that came out on Crime and Punishment in the last month or two. A particularly great one is by the late Deborah Martinsen, who was a professor at Columbia and also a past president of the North American and International Dostoevsky Societies, died sadly in December. But she's got out a wonderful new reader's guide to Crime and Punishment, which is out with Academic Studies Press. It's a very short volume, comes in at like 113 pages, but just a really, really smart and just even though it's small, it's a really, really brilliant analysis of the novel that I think will be helpful to both students and any readers of Crime and Punishment. And then the other volume is perhaps more interesting to those who teach the novel, which is that the Modern Languages Association, MLA, has a set of a series called Approaches to Teaching, and there's one on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, edited by Michael Katz and Alex Burry, which also just came out recently. So your listeners might want to take a look at those volumes as well.
Definitely. I've had my eye on that last one. I saw it coming out and I was like, I wish it came out just like a month earlier from when we were doing the series. But definitely check it out for sure.
Yeah, I remember Matt sending that book to me. He's like, "Oh, this would be perfect." And then like a few texts later, "Oh, wait a minute,
not quite out yet."
Not out yet, but yes, we'll go ahead and include links to all those things in the show notes, either directly to the article or to places you can acquire those books, because I think that'd be great. Like you said, great for people to pick up if they're really interested in this topic.
Plus 130 pages. That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Yeah, and actually there's also, if people are interested, recently there's an event that was organized by the North American Dostoevsky Society together with the Harriman Institute at Columbia and the Academic Studies Press, which was kind of a launch for that book, which is available on our YouTube site on the North American Dostoevsky YouTube. So people might want to check that out too.
We'll send Cameron digging for that.
Okay.
That way he can provide those links.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, now that we got all that other Dostoevsky stuff out of the way, we can get to the important question of the day. What are you drinking on this podcast?
I'm drinking a tiki cocktail. It's called Jungle Bird. It's a nice orange color with rum in it and a couple of other ingredients.
That looks nice. Sounds nice.
Yeah. Not very Crime and Punishment, but, tastes good.
Well, in a way, it could be. Let me get back to that in a second because I have
Okay.
a new segment for just this part of the podcast. What are you drinking, Cameron? Or are you?
I am unfortunately not today. I'm technically still at work, so I got to clock back in after this. And I don't think my boss will be really happy if I come back tipsy. So I have got a San Pellegrino for now.
Okay. I'll allow it. I'll allow it, but I will request Cameron is heckled on Twitter.
I think my contract at the government may not be super happy about that. But they may take some action on that. How about you, Matt?
I'm drinking a bullet bourbon. The only drink my dog will let me have in peace because he doesn't like the smell of it, so he stays away from me.
That's funny.
So speaking of new segments for the podcast, I was scrolling through Reddit before this. That's because that's where you can find all the good Russian literature things. And I saw, I won't name them by name. I'll do an abridged version of the worst take on the epilogue I've seen so far. So we really do get a happy ending after all. The court was really lenient on him, and life in prison doesn't sound all that bad, really. I digress. We can talk about if that's a bad take. I contend life in prison sounds bad, and also that's not what happened.
Yes, well, we can talk about that a little bit more later. Before we get there, let's do a quick recap.
Please.
And for those of you who are reading along, you may already know that this is only like 20 or 30 pages. So thankfully, you're going to be spared 40 minutes of me just lecturing at you about what happened. Or we'll see. I don't know. I've got some kind of a talent for drawing things out. So let's talk briefly about what happens in the epilogue. So obviously, last time we ended on the Raskolnikov finally admitting to our friend, the explosive lieutenant, that he had in fact committed the crime. So we open up on the banks of a broad solitary river stands a town, one of the administrative centers of Russia. In the town, there is a fortress, and in the fortress, there is a prison. In the prison, the second-class convict, Rodion Raskolnikov, has been confined for 9 months. So we learn about the events of Raskolnikov's trial following this, and this chapter is a little bit out of order. We'll be jumping around back and forth a bit. It's noted that during his trial, he was unusually forthright, pretty much just laying out exactly what he did, where the money is, where everything was left, why he did it, and it's basically to the disbelief of those at the trial. They really are not sure how to deal with him. Some of them even trying to say, "Oh no, this man's insane. He's not mentally competent for this," but he seems quite logical to everyone else and is just like, no, this is why I did it. I wanted to prove this idea.
And of course, it's interesting that, all the complicated motives that we've seen throughout the novel, those are gone, right? And in the court case, it's just this very straightforward, this was it. This is why I did it. Moving on.
Yeah. And now everyone's like, we don't know what to do with this. We thought we had many ideas. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the same time as he's going through this trial, Pulcheria's mother has taken ill. You might recall in the last part that when he went to tell her that he was going away, she almost didn't seem to understand and kept asking him, "Oh, but you'll be back, right? You'll be back tomorrow or the next day and you'll be around." And he leaves telling her simultaneously, "I'm going to be gone for a long time, but also, yes, mother, I'll return soon." And Pulcheria seems to be under the impression that Raskolnikov is out in Siberia for some kind of business venture, and to the extent that she is, even when going outside with Dunya, telling people about her son Raskolnikov and his business dealings, in the East, which Dunya is quite concerned that someone's going to be like, "Oh, you mean Raskolnikov, the guy who was sent to Siberia for axe murder?" Thankfully for her, no one says that, although Dunya does kind of suspect that Pulcheria knows a lot more than she maybe lets on. We learn more about Raskolnikov's sentencing, and he's eventually, I believe, sent to Siberia about 5 months after his confession. And in the days before, Raskolnikov is quite concerned with his mother, often asking about her health. And at the same time, Razumikin and Dunya are making plans to follow Raskolnikov to Siberia. Razumikin has returned to school to finish up his education. They received some amount of money, so they're planning to use that to try to build that. And amidst all that, Raskolnikov is sent to Siberia, where Sonia also follows him. Several months after that time, Razumikin and Dunya are also married, which is, as you might understand, a relatively somber affair. Interestingly, Porfiry and Zosimov are both invited. Actually, this is something I should double back to real quickly. It's also noted that Porfiry kept his promise that he didn't tell the courts about basically guessing and somewhat forcing Raskolnikov to confess, which also helped to a relative leniency in his crime, in addition to him being forthright and telling everyone where the money is and then finding that the money was still there. So at the fever pitch of all of this and in her sickness, Pulcheria finally dies. It's hard for Dunya to convey this to Sonia and Raskolnikov, because at that point, Sonia's letters are quite cut and dry, basically describing just what's happening, and it's hard to get a lot of knowledge about what's happening out there, but they do kind of get the sense that things are not going super well, and eventually their fears are kind of confirmed when Sonia confirms to them that Raskolnikov is really not well liked by the other prisoners, although she herself has become very well liked and kind of a feature, an important person in the town. And we end this chapter learning that Raskolnikov has fallen quite ill. Chapter 2, we rejoin Raskolnikov, and it's really fitting that rejoining him, we go from a more general overview what's happening to a lot of interrogation of his circumstances and what's going on in the recent events. Raskolnikov, while sick, notes that it's not really like illness per se that's taken him down. It's really his own kind of sense of jumbled feeling towards himself. It's shame in a sense, and it's written, "It was not his shaven head and his fetters he was ashamed of. His pride had been stung to the quick. It was wounded pride that had made him ill. How happy he would have been if he could have blamed himself. He could have borne anything then, even shame and disgrace. But he judged himself severely, and his exasperated conscience found no particularly terrible fault in his past, except a simple blunder which might happen to anyone."
No, and I think there the importance, the difference between feeling guilt and feeling shame is really key here, right? And actually that Deborah Martinsen in her reader's guide, she's written a lot about shame, and she sees kind of shame as kind of all about yourself, right? There's sort of there's no in a way reflection as part of shame, right? Whereas and we should probably talk about guilt later on, but shame really here dominates, right? Guilt is still to come.
Yes, exactly. We'll put a flag in that, because there's a lot to discuss there.
Yep.
Because he's still thinking a lot about his theory, and he's still thinking that mere existence, it's written, is too little. And it's agonizing him, like this shame of not failing particularly that caused what he's come to, but rather a blunder, just something that just happened to him. It wasn't really even a fault of it. Oh, well, it kind of was his fault, but that's not how he's thinking about it. He's thinking that this could have happened to anyone. That's the terrible thing, that my failure in this sort of great man theory is just that there was something out of my control. And he's wondering through this, why he didn't kill himself like Svidrigailov. And through it all, the other prisoners really hate him, even though there are other prisoners, some Polish prisoners, some Russian prisoners who were seminarians, or others who were kind of involved in political attempts at political upheavals, who kind of look down at the general population. Even despite all those, he is uniquely disliked and even attacked by people claiming him to be an infidel, and brutally beaten. You're getting a sense of why, when Matt was bringing up earlier about Raskolnikov's conditions, why maybe it's not so bad, maybe overselling Raskolnikov's experiences. And at some point he takes ill, and he has a dream. And sorry, this is going to be a little bit longer, but I'm going to read parts of this dream, because there's a lot to look at here. And if you have not read all of Crime and Punishment, first of all, we highly recommend you do. But also, if you're coming to this part, you should definitely read. I mean, if you haven't read the rest of Crime and Punishment, I can't in good conscience tell you read the epilogue. But this part, I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you've read the epilogue, because there's a lot. This is like a very dense section of ideas. So Raskolnikov dreams that the whole world was condemned to a terrible new strange plague. All were to be destroyed except a few chosen. Some new sorts of microbes were attacking the bodies of men, but these microbes were endowed with intelligence and will. Men attacked by them became at once mad and furious, but never had men considered themselves so intellectual and so completely in possession of the truth as those suffering. Never had they considered their decisions, their scientific conclusions, their moral convictions so infallible. Whole villages, whole towns, and peoples went mad from the infection. All were excited and did not understand each other. Each thought that he alone had the truth and was wretched looking at the others, beat himself on the breast, wept, and wrung his hands. They did not know how to judge and could not agree what to consider evil and what good. They did not know whom to blame, whom to justify. The most ordinary trades were abandoned because everyone proposed his own ideas, his own improvements, and they could not agree. Only a few men could be saved in the whole world. So that's a slightly abridged version of the dream, but wakes up and thinks obviously quite a terrible dream. Through this all, Sonia is obviously stuck by him. Raskolnikov is very dismissive of Sonia, really dismissive of someone who has followed him to Siberia, and by all accounts has done quite well for herself, up to when Sonia suddenly stops visiting him and he becomes suddenly very worried until he finally gets a letter saying that she's fallen sick, but still is basically trying to despite being ill herself after coming to Siberia and establishing a whole life, being like, okay, I hope you're okay. And at that point, he kind of has some acknowledgement that, well, not specific acknowledgement. He just is like, his heart's beating as he's reading that letter. One day, he and some other convicts are out at the riverbank to work, and while Raskolnikov is just sitting there and looking at the river, Sonia comes up to him and she gives him her hand, somewhat tentatively, as if she wonders if he's going to reject it. And all at once, he suddenly throws himself at her feet. And he throws himself at his feet at a lot of points in this book. And Sonia kind of has this realization that truly, or at least she thinks, okay, truly he must love me. And they're unable to think. Pale and thin and sick faces. They were bright all at the same time at the dawn of a new future, of a full resurrection into a new life. And following that, Raskolnikov has the sense that his agonies and his troubles are all of the past.
I think it's also worth pointing out here that this is taking place in Holy Week, right? So this is, and actually, interestingly, I'm not sure whether you planned this, but it's actually Holy Week now. So it's exactly this time of year, right? We're recording this on the Saturday before Easter. And so this is kind of the time, right, when this is all taking place.
Yeah, we didn't plan that, but this is a nice, it's a nice coincidence. And fitting with the themes of Holy Week and the themes of resurrection, everything, even his crime, his sentence and imprisonment, seemed to him now, in the first rush of feeling, an external, strange fact with which he had no concern. He could not think of anything, and he could not have analyzed anything consciously. He was simply feeling. Life had stepped into the place of theory, and something quite different would work itself out in his mind. And he takes up the copy of the New Testament under his pillow, which Sonia, despite being very religious, has never forced upon him until he asked for it, and thinks upon the story of Lazarus, which she read to him before he confessed his murder to her. Sonia, too, is feeling quite ill, and despite feeling quite ill, she's so happy that she's almost afraid of that happiness. And at this point, the narrator says, this is the beginning of a new story, one of gradual renewal of a man, his gradual regeneration, of his passing from one world into another, of his initiation into a new unknown life. That might be the subject of a new story, but our present story has ended. And with that, we leave Crime and Punishment, one of the darkest parts, followed by one of the most kind of not light almost parts, as light as you get in Dostoevsky.
So it's interesting that you missed out my favorite ambiguous moment at the very end of the epilogue, which is the penultimate paragraph right before the last. Mm-hmm. So you talked about the new story beginning, but in that penultimate paragraph, the last sentence is, he didn't even know that his new life was not being given to him for free, that it would still cost him dear, that it would have to be paid for with a great future deed. So that is an interesting moment that sort of, the epilogue, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is kind of dotted with all kinds of intriguing moments that suggest that all is perhaps not quite as it seems.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. There is, in addition to, again, harkening back to Matt's original thought on some Reddit takes on this book, some little pinpricks here in the epilogue.
Just perhaps not a text for hot takes, right? I think probably not.
No, as we know well from Anna Karenina, all of light is made up of light and shadow. So
Please make it stop.
So yeah, the epilogue. Wow. I don't even know where to start with this. Kate, where would you, if you were approached, talking? I mean, we are approaching talking about this. Where do we start, do you think?
So, I mean, we could start by talking about the controversy about the epilogue, right? So, whenever I teach this, we always get into it with the epilogue, right? Does Dostoevsky prepare for the epilogue? Do people buy Raskolnikov's final conversion, or do they not? Right, that's the big question that's been debated really since the novel was published. So does Dostoevsky prepare the way for the epilogue, or is it something that just comes kind of out of nowhere? right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's various answers to whether to how he prepares the way. I personally think that he does, and that the epilogue is not just the sort of Bakhtin was not a big fan of the epilogue, right? He sees it as kind of tacked on somehow. That the great dialogic Dostoevsky kind of becomes monologic in the epilogue, which I absolutely disagree with him about. In fact, I think that the epilogue is as dialogic as any other part of the novel. But one interesting thing that happens as we move towards the epilogue is that the narrator begins to take on a new temporal perspective, right? So what he begins to do, and actually I wanted to point to a section at the beginning of part 6. For Raskolnikov, a strange time had begun. It was as if a fog had suddenly descended, trapping him in hopeless, oppressive isolation. Recalling this time much later, he surmised that he'd experienced now and then a dimming of his consciousness, and that this had continued with a few intervals right up until the final catastrophe. So that way in which the narrator kind of moves to the kind of successful conclusion, right? The final catastrophe, the moment at which Raskolnikov has presumably finally been converted, right? Or has finally confessed, right? That kind of end point. As we move towards the end of the novel, that endpoint becomes more palpable, and it becomes something that, so in a sense, Dostoevsky kind of is preparing the way on the level of the narrative perspective there, I think.
I feel like there should have been less time between my sequential reads, so I could have read it backwards and looked for these things.
Yes.
I didn't do that. But thank you for pointing this out, because this is interesting.
And then the other is, of course, one very important point that I already sort of began to make is that the epilogue is not a straightforward conversion story, right? First of all, as you narrated, right, as you kind of told the lead up, it's evident that in fact most of the epilogue, Raskolnikov's in exactly the same state as he was for most of the novel, right? The conversion only happens at the very end, and it's interesting, of course, that the punishment is the epilogue, right? Uses up such a small amount of space compared to the crime, right? That they're kind of equivalent to one another, these two sections, in terms of sort of semantically equivalent in the title, and yet they are also, just so much. The crime so far overbalances the punishment, right, in terms of number of pages. Yeah, so there's just so many ways in which I think that the idea that Dostoevsky somehow is letting everyone down at the end just doesn't ring true to me.
Yeah, that was something when I was preparing for this. There was, a paper which I read like half a week ago, and I do not remember who wrote it, unfortunately, which was a defense of the epilogue, and I will link it once.
Oh, yeah. Matual, David Matual, I think his name is. Yeah.
That's it, yes. And I when I came into it, I did initially have that thought, and I was like, the epilogue needs defending. And that it is an interesting thought. I can see where maybe if you have like, if you go into it and you maybe haven't been thinking too much about some of the particulars of this novel, and it made me think of another piece. And I honestly, over the weeks we've read so many papers for this, I do not remember if this is something that was from Dostoevsky or for 200 or something else, but it was a paper, which again I will link in the show notes, about Dostoevsky's relationship to kind of this idea of like averages. Of like
Greta Matzner-Gore and like the idea of the Poetics of probability, right? That was
yes,
in Dostoevsky at 200.
Okay, perfect. Yes. Glad that was an accurate remembrance of that. But Matzner-Gore pointed out that in some ways, keep doing this is the biggest problem with this podcast is confusing Dostoevsky and Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov in many ways is kind of like a rejection of like that averages, because in many ways he is not himself an average person, like for being, a young 23-year-old dude who has this idea that if I can commit crimes and become a great man of history, in many ways that is an average. That's like a very average thing for like 23-year-olds to be. But in many ways, Raskolnikov is not the average of that. He shows great amounts of empathy and disregard for himself, and giving away money to people, people he finds on the street, to helping that young girl with the man who's following her, with giving all of his mother's money to Katerina Ivanovna when Marmeladov dies for the funeral. And in like this ending feels very like an embrace of that rather than just like a sudden reversal. Yeah, if you're paying attention, it feels right.
Yeah.
In that same passage that you pointed out, actually in the beginning of part 6, it says he learned a great deal about himself from what other people told him. And then in the epilogue, you have this whole scene during the trial where we're learning as well about him from other people, what he's done that's actually good.
Right.
And not something a Napoleon would probably do.
Yeah, so I mean, the trial is also interesting, right? That here you get also a foreshadowing of Dostoevsky's criticisms of trial by jury, right? And of the whole sort of criminal justice system that, of course, we're going to get, that we get fully expressed in the Brothers Karamazov, right, later on, with the sort of whole section of that novel as a sort of parody of how trials took place in the 1870s. And of course 1864 is a key year because that's the year of the codification of the new legal system, right? New judicial system and the introduction of trial by jury. So the trial takes place, right? And with its sort of socially and legally sanctioned authority there. Of course, the story that emerges from the trial bears no resemblance to the story of the novel and the motives that Raskolnikov, in fact, had for the crime, right? So the trial is sort of a red herring, if you like, right?
Yeah. A lot to be said there. I also wanted to, not to shift the topic, but there's I want to talk about the dream a little bit more, because honestly, the dream is something that kind of confuses me in a way, looking at it, that it feels like, especially the things that stand out to me are like, okay, we're talking about this idea of everyone bringing on their coming to their own rational ideas of rightness and ability to connect with other people, but there's still like those the thing that stands out to me is those few men that could be saved who recreate the world anew, and there's no description of who they are, what that means, other than just that they aren't like the rest. This
is perfect. So what's going on here is this is a recapitulation of Raskolnikov's idea, right? Of course. So of course Raskolnikov is, of course, one of the people who has the ideological virus, right? But at the same time, what's happening here is quite interesting because there's a shift, and this actually is going to bring us to that great deed paragraph towards the end of the novel, that penultimate paragraph, that in fact, maybe the alternative to Raskolnikov's great man theory is not its entire rejection, but rather, do you remember, so one of the great aspects of the last couple of parts of the novel, and especially part 6 that you talked about in your last podcast, is the sort of competition between the vision of punishment and redemption, which Sonia embraces, right, for him, which Sonia embraces, and that which Porfiry embraces, right? And in fact, Porfiry, I think, towards the end of the novel, emerges as the sort of so in a sense, these various characters, so Porfiry and Sonia and Svidrigailov to some extent, they all become kind of plotters of Raskolnikov's fate, right? So Svidrigailov sort of he represents the path to suicide. Sonia represents the sort of straightforward Christian moral paradigm, right? That he will confess, that his crime will be expiated, and that he will be redeemed. And then Porfiry represents something else, because of course Porfiry is a Christian. Porfiry wants Raskolnikov to be punished. He's a lawyer, right? He's a detective. He's within the system. But at the same time, he recognizes the brilliance of Raskolnikov. He recognizes the possibility of some kind of a great future for Raskolnikov. And what's interesting, there's another section I wanted to point out, which is the conversation between Porfiry and Raskolnikov in part 6, when Porfiry has already acknowledged that he knows that Raskolnikov is guilty. And they're talking about punishment. And he's saying about how you need to suffer, right? The need to suffer. But then he says, had you gone and come up with some other theory, you might have gone and done something 1 billion times more ghastly. Perhaps it's God we should be thanking. God might just be saving you for something. How can you know? So have a great heart and a bit less fear. What? Are you shying away from the great duty ahead of you, right? So the idea there is that Porfiry seems to be suggesting actually not the rejection entirely of Raskolnikov's great man idea, but rather that maybe God has something planned for Raskolnikov. Maybe there is this potentiality in Raskolnikov that can somehow still be used, right? And so this kind of this sort of resurrectability, if you like, that you were talking about before, right? All the good deeds that he does for these the sort of the poor of St. Petersburg. There is something in Raskolnikov that Porfiry seems to recognize. And so rather than needing to utterly prostrate himself to become as meek as Sonia, right, that he can somehow retain his pride. And so in that dream, what you get is a kind of a sort of pivot from Raskolnikov's vision to Porfiry's vision, right? That Raskolnikov can, in the end, be one of the few who don't have the virus, that he can be one of the chosen who emerge from this kind of from this ideological nightmare unscathed, if you like, right? So the dream also kind of prepares the way for another possible reading of the epilogue that sees Raskolnikov not as Sonia would have him, right? As someone who's emptied of all his like great man fantasies and just filled with, humility and Christian compassion, but rather someone who could in fact be some kind of hero in this new kind of future that might lie ahead of him after Siberia.
It sounds kind of similar. I mean, and you're reading Matzner-Gore's argument that in many ways of this novel, Dostoevsky is not just like denouncing and trouncing on the ideas of rationality around the time, but rather advocating for like a more nuanced take on the topic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that, that Porfiry's vision of what Raskolnikov could be, is in many ways more, I hate the word relatable, but, in a way, Porfiry's vision of a future for a radical student is more, feasible in a sense, right? That he should contribute to some kind of, future society rather than, becoming like Sonia and, just sort of prostrating himself before the world, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Yet all the same, when he wakes up, he kind of considers it. Well, what's the word? He thinks of it. He was worried that it would haunt his memory senselessly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as always, right? The dreams are they sort of represent the kind of psychological undercurrents or deep structures of the novel, right? But he's not quite there yet, right? And in fact, he's not really there at the end of the novel, as Dostoevsky often does. He's kind of pointing off into some future moment, right? But it's interesting. I think the other moment that you mentioned in your synopsis that I think is also interesting is when he's is in the second part, right? He still is trapped in his kind of existential dead end, right? Of he's not really he's ashamed, but he's not really feeling guilty, and he's remembering how he why didn't he commit suicide? He's asking himself, right? Why is he still here? For what reason? And what he's looking for, like he needs some greater vision. This idea of a kind of a meaningless delirium, right? That he surely there should be something more, right? What he's looking for is something more. So that Dostoevsky still seems to be suggesting that, he's kind of barking up the wrong tree. So the conversion moment somehow does need to happen. Another interesting, one other thing I forgot to mention is that we should definitely also think about the autobiographical elements of this epilogue as well, right? Because of course Dostoevsky himself had spent time as a convict in Siberia. And in fact, that moment when he looks across the river at the nomads on the other side of the river is the Irtish, and it's actually mentioned in Notes from the House of the Dead, Dostoevsky's fictionalized memoir about his time in Siberia. That passage also appears there as Goryanchikov, who's kind of Dostoevsky's alter ego there, also looks across the river at the nomads and sees them representing some kind of a timeless a historical vision, right? Some kind of a moment before the fall. And again, Dostoevsky always has this fantasy about some kind of a time before history, where everything is more straightforward, right?
Yeah.
So you see that there too, I think. And so that landscape is very interesting as the Siberian landscape is obviously so different from St. Petersburg as a kind of space for regeneration and redemption, right? That it seems to. But at the same time, of course, especially in the current situation, a lot of us are beginning to read Russian novels now with a lot more sensitivity towards questions of imperial expansion and, thinking about decolonizing the field. And of course, the idea that the nomads have no history somehow, right? And only Raskolnikov as a Russian has some kind of history, right, is obviously a very questionable claim, right? And one which needs to be unpacked.
Yeah, I guess that is something that, to your point about that, of like an evolution of this notion of one's relationship to the world, where it's like not an entire rejection of this so-called great man idea, but like an evolution of it.
Yeah.
It's impossible to get away from that. Like that is still associated with the Napoleons, maybe a more kinder, sensitive Napoleon, whatever that means, but it's still a Napoleon.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, that's where we really get to that penultimate paragraph, right? So he's using the word, so when he says he didn't even know that his new life was not being given to him for free, that it would still cost him dear, that it would have to be paid for with a great future deed. He uses the word podvig, right, which is the word that's associated often with a Russian folk hero, right, the bogatyr, the like epic hero of Russian epic, of Slavic folk epic. And so that word is also used by Porfiry earlier on in the novel to be as something, so, and that kind of reconceives Raskolnikov as some kind of almost like epic hero who has failed in the sort of nature of what he did, but that still has some kind of sort of future destiny that somehow he needs to be carried out. And actually, also, it surprises me how often that sentence gets forgotten as people sort of focus on the idea of redemption and on Raskolnikov finally finding God. By the way, when he picks up the Bible, he doesn't open it, which is also kind of an ambiguous moment there too, right? That on the one hand, yes, the Bible is there, but he doesn't actually open it. So. So it's, I mean, like with all of Dostoevsky's sort of epiphanic moments, like you see also in The Brothers Karamazov and in various other places, he always holds something back, right? It's supposed to be a moment of mystery that cannot really be truly conveyed, sort of in a novelistic, in a secular genre like the novel, right? So.
That is interesting, because that was something that I thought about. It's actually to your point about leaving out the ambiguous elements when I was putting together my notes in the summary, because the way that section leads off, at least in the text, and of course maybe this is subject to translations you're using, but it kind of like you said, it opens up and says he did not open it now, but one thought passed through his mind. Can her convictions not be mined down? Her feelings, her aspirations, at least. ... And that's not like, that is kind of like almost like I guess, yeah. I mean, what else do I have?
Yes.
I feel good, and Sonia feels good, so maybe this is it.
Yeah, and the ... is also, always an interesting moment when there's some kind of gap.
Yeah, because I guess that's his last, technically, his last thought in the book of, I guess this is it. To your point of this ambiguity leading to the future of maybe he's still going to be not fully engaging with this kind of, servility of like godliness that you see in Sonia.
Yeah, and another thing I was going to say is we, from the very beginning, were encouraged to compare Raskolnikov's trajectory with that of Razumikhin. And as you were reading through your summary, it reminded me that Razumikhin goes back to university at the end, goes back to his studies. And that's the perfect end for a Bildungsroman hero, right? And it's Razumikhin. The Bildungsroman is a really important genre for all of Dostoevsky's novels, for the 19th century novel in general, but particularly for Crime and Punishment. And of course, that's the genre of the kind of hero coming to experience in the world, right? Coming to know about himself or herself in the world. And it's kind of living in the world instead of going to university, right? The Bildungsroman hero or heroine is usually a student age, but, having their education in the world instead of at school. And often the successful end of the Bildungsroman is that the student can go back to school, right? And so that's what happens to Razumikhin. But Raskolnikov has never really been that kind of conventional Western generic novelistic hero, right? He's something else. So he's not going back to school, right? He's not going back to do his translations, He's not going back to any of those options that were offered earlier on in the novel. Instead, he's gonna, him and Sonia are gonna go off and, fulfill some great future deed, right? They're gonna fulfill some kind of destiny, right? So it's interesting there how the end of the novel cannot just and it's Razumikhin who gets the marriage plot, right? It's him who gets the kind of successful marriage to Dunya and the successful end to his Bildungsroman, and it's Raskolnikov who's off in Siberia about to begin some other kind of new story. And of course, Dostoevsky is struggling all the time with he recognizes his debts to the 19th century Western novel, right? To the European novel, secular novel, but at the same time he's looking for something else, right? Which is why Lukács claimed that Dostoevsky didn't write novels, right? That he was pointing towards some kind of modern epic, in fact, right? And you see that at the end of all of the novels, right? You see it at the end of Crime and Punishment, you see it at the end of the Brothers Karamazov, and part of what Dostoevsky's doing is he's kind of refusing to kind of tie it all up, right? He's leaving the end open. He's pointing out into the future.
That's really interesting you bring that up. Do you mind? I want to pose something to you, and this is a weird tension that, as you're talking, kind of comes to mind, and it's probably a tension born of like me not overlooking something. But we have obviously Raskolnikov's storyline of going through quote unquote great man ideas, coming to the end is kind of, we were talking about this evolution of it, of like, okay, maybe that's actually kind of a virus where like it kind of blocks us off from other people, and maybe we need to take this and like reform it in some way.
Yep.
That almost seems to be at tension with Razumikhin as a person who is someone who is kind of like a Slavic Superman, where he can be everything at once. He can be funny, he can be boisterous, he can be the life of the party, but he can also be totally sober, a great student, good worker, all that kind of stuff. And he, to your point, almost has like this kind of typical Western story arc where he's a student, then he drops out to go pursue industry and go make money in his own way,
yeah.
And then he gets this marriage plot, and he ends by going back to school, and he's like someone that's never infected with this like great man theory. He's one of the people who simply, under this idea, exists to replicate himself, but like in this final, in this final way, or like Razumikhin and almost everyone else who's not infected, quote unquote, the idea of like of I hold the truth. They almost seem like they would be the ones who would be pushing life onward, like almost as if the great mass of humanity that simply replicates itself then becomes that few.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think in a sense, if Dostoevsky was another writer, then that would be the case, right? But he is, after all, a former convict himself. He is, he never really buys into the kind of conventional ending, right? He, becomes this strange conservative, but who's also a kind of radical messianic nationalist, right? But who's also kind of has sympathies later on in life towards the populists who are also assassinating people left, right, and center, right? His politics are so confused and complex and really not reducible down to anything. And you already see that in the 1860s in Crime and Punishment, in the ambiguity of the ending, I think.
Okay, that makes sense. That kind of, I guess, resolves it by not resolving it in a sense. I don't know if that makes sense. But
I'm afraid I'm a big fan of that with Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
I think my students always groan because I always refuse to resolve anything because they're radically open-ended, his novels. So
yeah. It almost be on Dostoevsky and to say, well, this is the final note on it. This is how you're understanding.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm afraid at the end of this episode, you're going to have to point out towards the future and, say that, what do you all think of it? Well, that's a story for another time that will be told, when everybody's ready.
Yeah, that's fun. Which is where it leaves us. It's like, well, there's obviously, I mean, maybe that's like, I think Dr. Shirley pointed this out last year. We've been doing this series for a long time, not quite that long.
Yeah.
Last episode, that kind of, if you kind of make a generalization, the Russian novel is not about like American novels, like The Great Marriage or leading up to that. It's about waking up the day after and realizing you still have to live your life.
Exactly.
And this kind of ends. Yeah, it ends on there is still life to be lived despite all of this. There's still life to live, and maybe even the great thing was not even covered in this story.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And even if there is a magic marriage plot, it's usually about something else, right? It's just kind of a metaphor for something else. So yeah. It's not about property. It's not about property, and it's not about marriage. It's a symbol of something else.
Yeah.
I do wonder, though, on this last line that we're talking about, I've been mulling this over because I don't know how I feel about it. In the chapter 1 of the dialogue, the narrator obviously is just, to me, it's a much more impartial tone. Part 2 is back inside of his head. And so this line that says he would have to pay dearly for it, or this great deed, I'm wondering, is this then his own projection into the narrator? That's what I'm...
Yes. No, and I think, and it's Porphyry's, and it's also Porphyry's voice, which is being projected here too. So
Right.
I think, I mean, I'm not sure whether one could really resolve that question as to whether I see what
it's
you mean.
interesting. Yeah, it is.
But I also do think that line is just in such a strategically significant position at the end of a paragraph that's talking about Sonia, and it's just so whatever it's saying, whether we're talking about Raskolnikov not having, whatever it's saying is not, it's clear that Raskolnikov has not taken Sonia's path of of abject humiliation in his conversion, and so yeah.
I do. Okay, well, I'll ask you about like the conversion. I feel like I want to talk more about that because I am wondering, do you buy the conversion? Is that the question to even ask about the conversion? What do you look for when you read through this kind of part? It's a lot. There's so much there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna give a kind of literary scholar cop out response to that and say, what's interesting about the conversion is what it means narratively, right? I don't. In a way, it doesn't matter whether or not I buy the conversion. That's, of course, not really how I speak to my undergraduates, because I mean, of course, it's a very valid question as to whether a reader, really believes it or not. What I do think is that there are these three moments in the text, right? There's the moment of the crime, there's the moment of the confession, and there's the moment of the conversion. And each of these moments is kind of radically open, and it could mean the end of the story, right? So the idea is that, at one point Raskolnikov sees, the crime has kind of one of his motives, right, is that the crime will resolve the question as to whether he's a great man or whether he's a louse, right? And of course, then there's the other side of it, which is by already by asking that question, it shows that he's a louse, right? And he sort of recognizes that afterwards. So the idea that the crime, but then there's the other interpretation of the crime as the beginning interpretation of the crime as being as enabling him to save the world, right? To take the money and to kind of create possibilities for his family and for the poor of St. Petersburg and so on. So just as the crime, I think, is this open moment that can either mean the end of the story or the beginning of a new story, the same is true of the confession, right? That depending on how he confesses, that could either be the end of the story. So if he confesses, he's going to be punished. Maybe it's the end of his kind of possibility of being a great man, or maybe it's the beginning of the possibility of him being a good Christian, right? And then there's the conversion, and the same thing happens, right? That the conversion also could be either the end of his story, right? The end of his great man idea, his recognition of sort of his humility before God, or it could be the beginning of a new story, which is what that kind of penultimate paragraph perhaps seems to imply. So I think what's interesting not so much is the question of whether you actually buy the conversion, but what it means in terms of kind of the structure of the story.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about this as well because I just happened to be reading some poetry for class this week, not related to the podcast, but as I was kind of rereading through the epilogue, I was reading some Zhukovsky for class, and he has this poem, Voice from the Beyond, or Voice from Your World, and it's not a Zhukovsky podcast, so I won't get too much into it, but these ideas of unifying in one world this like otherworldly force and your kind of earthly force was interesting in reading through the epilogue, and then some of his other poetry, a lot of the signature moves are describing something that is undescribable and kind of coming to this moment of, well, I can't exactly describe it, but I know that it's there. And there's like this very similar feeling when I'm reading through the epilogue, in which it's not really intended to answer the question, but it is posing it in a way that we can recognize and acknowledge that there has to be something more. Yes. And this is like interesting that I feel that he's drawing on the source actually pretty heavily, at least for the epilogue. I don't know, I'd have to reread it and kind of parse it out. But
yeah, and I think the endings of all of these novels, Crime and Punishment, also the Brothers Karamazov, also point towards the very interesting late story of his, Dream of a Ridiculous Man, which is, of course, the story of a man who kind of sees the truth. He has this kind of vision of paradise, and he corrupts that paradise in that vision. And at the end, he says, I've seen the truth, but everybody thinks he's a ridiculous man, right? Everybody thinks he's crazy, and he can't convey that truth to anybody. And, that idea of kind of having seen the truth, but being unable to convey it. I mean, for Dostoevsky, as a kind of visionary who's working with a secular genre, the 19th century novel, we have that everywhere in a sense, right?
Yeah, just that conflict. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've covered a lot of topics today. So just before we start to wrap up, just wanted to check in, see if there's any last things we wanted to cover.
I feel like I think we talked about most of the things that I wanted to kind of explain or discuss.
Yeah, cool. Definitely. In that case, Matt, unless you kind of come back around to your question when I finish it up on that.
No, I'm good. It's giving me a lot to think about, is all.
Well, I guess that's good for this story, because we, as we're finishing up this series, we're not really finishing it up in the sense that I hope you keep thinking about it, because that's kind of, as we've been discussing today, what it's all about, to not put a final note and be like, okay, here's where we stop, here's the story over, and here's the ideas to take away, but rather here's where we can start thinking about, here's where we can almost stop thinking falsely and start thinking, as maybe Dostoevsky would have you walk away as a reader, start thinking more clear-eyedly. Don't know if that's the correct word I'm looking for. I'm thinking more clearly about
clear-eyedly is the word.
Clear-eyedly. I am the arbiter of words. Yeah, clear-eyedly about how we approach the near future. Okay, well, in that case, Kate, thank you so much for helping us wrap this up. We genuinely had no idea how we were going to be able to pull this together.
I hope it was all right. And I didn't talk too much.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. And honestly, there's like a lot of things in my mind that was coming to the end. I was like, I don't know how to address this. I don't know how to even ask these questions. So this conversation has been good for both answering questions and even understanding how to formulate them about this novel.
Yeah, I was very happy to have the chance a few years ago to work on that epilogue special issue of Canadian Slavonic Papers, because I had, in the first few times I taught this novel, it was really hard for me to know what to do about the epilogue and how to close the classes on the Crime and Punishment. But I feel like now I have more of a handle on it, and like how to close it without closing it, right?
I like that. Close it without closing it.
The ending is about as tight as the security in the Siberian prison, where they just let people wander off.
I can't. That Reddit bad take is like really quite a bad take. I guess you can do it with anything now.
I mean, maybe we should reduce all of our analyses from an hour of conversation down to just a couple sentences, and that'll help get things across.
My favorite is when it's happened to me a couple of times that students have written papers on Crime and Punishment, and it became quite clear that they hadn't actually finished reading the novel, and that I think the one particular one I remember was on the motive. And, they had obviously not read past the first 100 pages or so, because the motive was the motive as it emerges in part 1 of the novel before they'd got to part 3. So the great man theory didn't even make an appearance. So
it kind of reminds me, I don't know if either of you ever watched True Detective, but the massive fandom who, if you've never been familiar, they've got this one character who's, dark and gritty, and everyone loves him, and of course at the end he strays away from all of that, and his point is that maybe life isn't so bad, much less not intelligent, but like much less broad reaching point. But the entire fandom talking about it is like, man, isn't this guy cool? He's so nihilistic, shying away from. I don't know if you watch the rest of the show, but that's kind of the whole thing is about how maybe we shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure how you can finish the book and the first word that you write when you go to compose your thoughts is "Aw." So I was cursed by Reddit today.
Yeah,
when I was doing that.
I'm impressed that you decided that thought I'm going to prep for this, and at any point we're like, I think I'll go on Reddit.
Yeah, I was like, I had a few things to talk about, and then I was like, I'll just look on Reddit because I like to be amused and or angry.
But I have to say, I appreciate the having a drink in hand while talking about the text approach. Definitely,
it's the way to go.
It helps a lot.
I'm not sure I'll be able to bring it into my lectures, but
probably not.
I've found through the many episodes, although having the drink is much nicer, having a sparkling water or something.
Yeah,
is
you can also pretend. Yeah, exactly.
Oh well, but of course the drink there's no substitute for the drink if it's something like part 6, and you're like,
right,
I need to drink 3 more beers before I describe this next section. Hold on.
Yes, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been hugely informative and enjoyable.
Welcome. Thanks for inviting me. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.